Hello again on the UK edition. In a week when the trigger has been pulled, a trigger with a 2-year timer. It's been a marriage that's lasted 44 years and it has had its difficult moments all the way. But would it have been smarter to stay married? We'll know, as with most marriages that end after it's over. Westminster is in any case quite a place for weddings and divorces.
We as a country have got to rediscover the art of self-governance, not just the technical details about how to make trade policy, but also to realise that actually when the public is able to hold public policymakers to account, anything is possible.
I feel a sense of optimism and anticipation, but also a recognition that this is a very big decision. Unravelling a 44-year relationship is a complicated business. There's a lot of hard work ahead of us.
Theresa May's statement was just cliché after cliché after cliché after platitudinous waffle. I thought she really let the country down today because there just was not enough in there for anybody to bite on, understand what we're really intending to do, and it just feels a bit as if she's waiting for something to come along.
I think it's something that is really, really important, and one of the messages I've been going out talking about is this idea that we have to put aside the division, and we have to, because actually Brexit shows that emotions trumped evidence, and we can't have that as we go through this negotiated period.
Brides and bridegrooms coming as ever to the scenic location of the British Parliament, but this is the beginning of divorce, one of the biggest days that this Parliament has ever known, and people are watching the detail of the drama step by step. Sir Tim Barrow, the British man for the EU, heading to Brussels, carrying the letter signed by Theresa May, the handing over of that letter to Donald Tusk, and beyond that, the confrontation of the big questions. None bigger than the trade issue. If Britain and EU were to trade on the same terms as Britain wants, EU itself could unravel. If Britain has to face tariffs, then British trade would be affected, exports to the EU would be cut, and that would be a huge blow to the British economy. And there's no way a trade with India, China and the US could compensate for loss with EU trade. In any case, the question of trade is not the only one. Attached to it and linked with it is the question of migration, the flow of workers, managers, staff, the services that is really very, very personnel heavy. If there are non-tariff barriers coming up there, that again would hurt the British economy very, very severely. So people are celebrating in a sense that they're raising the right slogans too, but beneath those slogans, big worries ahead.
We can choose to say the task ahead is too great. We can choose to turn our face to the past and believe it can't be done. Or we can look forward with optimism and hope and to believe in the enduring power of the British spirit. Yes. I choose to believe in Britain and that our best days lie ahead.
Yes. The same Theresa May had opposed Brexit strongly earlier. To be sure, there is now no turning back, but what is uncertain is what lies ahead.
Well, this was certain to be an occasion for fine and brave words, and we had plenty of them from the Prime Minister, along with a very firm clarification that there will be no turning back from Brexit, and the details, the nuts and bolts of this process underway will be published in a white paper Thursday. But beneath the brave words, we had enough signs of nerves within the government and warnings of pitfalls that may lie ahead. We had a clear warning from Theresa May that there will be consequences from Britain, and an offer of reassurance of sorts that the government will try to deliver certainty where possible. That can't have gone down well with the financial establishment. Business does not like uncertainty. Also, the Prime Minister promised more devolution for Scotland, for Northern Ireland. That again a sign of nerves, because the Scottish Parliament passed a resolution asking for a new referendum, and that could unravel Britain itself, never mind the EU. So a lot of trouble on the horizon while we see promises for a future.
The other partner across the English Channel sees the upcoming divorce its own way.
So here it is, 6 pages. The notification from Prime Minister Theresa May triggering Article 50 and formally starting the negotiations of the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. There is no reason to pretend that this is a happy day, neither in Brussels nor in London. After all, most Europeans, including almost half the British voters, wish that we would stay together, not drift apart. As for me, I will not pretend that that I'm happy today.
With Sanjay, Suri in London, this is Aditya Balaji for News 18.
At Westminster, many members of Parliament are very gung-ho about a new Britain coming up, negotiating new deals already with an India much strengthened after the UP elections under the Modi government. Let's have a word with Bob Blackman from the Conservative Party. Mr. Blackman, thanks very much for joining us. Now, what do you see as new possibilities in relations with India?
Well, the elections in India were wonderful news for both for India and I think Britain's relationship with India. Prime Minister Modi, who came to this country and addressed a record crowd at Wembley Stadium in a wet November evening, demonstrated with more than 60,000 people present, demonstrated the love there is of the Indian diaspora in this country for India, but also the growing relationship there is between the UK and India. This is a marriage of equal partners, not the old sort of colonial regime. And what's important is that we actually build relationships both at ministerial level but also at business level, and give everyone the opportunity for enhanced growth both in the Indian economy and in the UK economy. So I think the future is very bright for relationships. There's never a week goes by without someone from the UK government being in India building up those relationships, or alternatively someone from the Indian government coming here. So we are already the third biggest investor in India, and India is the third biggest investor in the UK. So those links are strong, and we go back 300 years of relationship. So I think we can build upon that.
Talking business, what will the impact likely be on Indian businesses in Britain? Businesses that are very strong in areas like retail, pharmacy, accountancy, real estate. Now, how will these businesses be affected by the new relations with EU post-Brexit?
Well, everyone was predicting dire economic consequences as a result of Britain's decision to leave the European Union. The fact is that hasn't happened. The economy is fundamentally strong.
But the pound has fallen.
The pound has fallen, but actually, if you look at the figures, the pound was elevated to an unsustainable level ahead of the referendum. So that we had a correction. But also, it's true to say it has depreciated by about 10%. But the reality is that as confidence is restored, and of course at the moment business is a bit concerned about what's going to happen with the negotiations. But as confidence is restored and people see the opportunities there are, then I suspect that the pound will increase in value as the euro, which has a bit of a wobbly past and I think a wobbly future, comes to terms, but also our relations with the United States, which actually affects the value of the pound far more.
And coming back to Indian businesses in your area?
Yes, the Indian businesses in our area, I mean, quite clearly that there's a lot of opportunity. Most Indians are either professionals, as you say, accountancy, the law, they're doctors, dentists, pharmacists, or alternatively they run their own businesses very effectively. There's great opportunities, I think, to build up business links with India. And the great thing is, this is the great thing, India has been trying to do a trade deal with the European Union for 20 years. And it's failed, it's stalled. I suspect that we, as friends of India, will be able to negotiate a trade deal which benefits India and the UK far easier than India has suffered with these stop-go negotiations. Now, clearly, there's work to do. It's not going to be a simple matter of saying, oh, well, let's do a deal. It's a case of sitting down, negotiating that deal. Over the next 2 years, that deal will be negotiated. And then once we've left the European Union, hopefully we'll have a deal ready to sign with India, which is beneficial to both sides and will increase the business growth between the two countries. So the Indian businesses locally in this country will gain, And I would say to anyone right now is build up those contacts, build up the empathy and what can be done with India right now, because the opportunity is going to be there very quickly.
You know, for a lot of businesses, London is the gateway to dealings with the EU. What happens if that gateway is shut, even to an extent?
Well, the reality is that we have a huge balance of payments deficit with the European Union. So there are trade-offs on both sides here. We are going to enter a negotiation for 2 years. Hopefully at the end of that 2 years we'll have an arrangement that suits both sides. There's all sorts of, at the moment, sabre rattling going on because we haven't started the negotiations. Once those negotiations start, I suspect that people will see that there's benefits to the European Union of being able to trade with the UK and therefore the world, as well as the UK seeing the benefit of trading with Europe. We want to get the best possible access to the single market, but if they deny us access, I think it will actually be to their detriment rather necessary than ours.
To the detriment of both, surely?
Exactly. And actually, I am seriously worried about the decision made by the G20, for example, that they are not in favour of free trade. I mean, we as in the UK want free trade across the world, and we want to encourage trade. So it's very important that actually we build those sort of links. But if the worst comes to the worst, there are plenty of countries that trade with the European Union on WTO agreements. If we have to, that's what we do. But we'd rather have a better relationship, of course we would. But, and this is where the big buck comes in, it's got to be beneficial to both sides. So no use, as we've heard recently with the European Union saying, we're going to punish Britain for leaving. That's not the rhetoric of friends. What we should be doing is saying, look, we are leaving, but we want to trade with you. We want the relationship. We want the security relationship. We want to help with defence and intelligence and so on, as well as trade. So it's that future relationship that we have to safeguard. And that takes two sides to sit down and negotiate with the right sort of spirit. And I'm sure that over the next 2 years we'll see that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Blackman, for joining us.
Thank you.
Many of us have similar views, of course, even if we have fears that the pound will take a further pounding, and some of us don't and are quite skeptical about the outcome that might follow from this. But let's listen into some views.
In my opinion, Brexit is good. We can be our own master, and politically we want to be ruled by local, not from Brussels.
We need to think how we can go forward. We need to make our new plan again, because we have a lot of consumer in here now as a Asian, Eastern European community, especially lives in Brent as well. So we need to protect them.
I believe that overcome the hardships initially, I think it is a rosy future for Britain.
I think there are so many uncertainties, and looking at it from a socio-political landscape, I just think the entire Brexit thing has pretty much become the entire question and entire debate about migration, and which is a rhetoric worldwide. Look at what's happening in America.
A lot of misleading campaigning, misinformation, and I think a confused decision. So that's why I'm not sure whether there'll be a celebration or whether they'll be grieving. More like grieving, I believe.
Scotland was a country which voted to remain in the European Union, and now they are being forced to alienate from Europe, and they wanted to separate from the United Kingdom. So I think it's going to have it's going to have impacts in more ways than one. Scotland may want another referendum, and rightly so, and we don't know what that's going to lead. What's that going to lead to? So I just think that the whole thing has sort of quantified the uncertain narrative that much more, and it's just not a very pleasant time to be in.
Quick break now, and then let's take a closer look which way Brexit might take Britain. Welcome back, and time for a word now with Professor Jagjit Chadha from the National Institute of Social and Economic Research, and let's see how he sees Britain going up or down. Professor Chadha, so the Prime Minister has said that there is no turning back. So there is no turning back, or is there?
Well, the Prime Minister is committed on the process of the UK leaving the European Union. The advisory referendum we had last year was advisory. There was no need for the government necessarily to have followed it. But we live in a mature democracy in the UK. The people have spoken, and in a sense the Prime Minister...
Not a lot of people have spoken.
The people who voted, 52% of the people voted to leave the European Union. The central expectation before the referendum is that it would be an easy victory for the Remainers. It wasn't. So in that sense, the people did speak, and they spoke very loudly. They told us something very important about the impact of globalization and the change in economic structure and the impact it's had on the country.
The have-nots. The have-nots wanted out.
When you say have-nots, I would start to think of them more as the people who'd been frustrated by outcomes. They may have expectations, and the expectations are completely standard in an advanced economy. Income tends to grow at 2% a year, which means that every 35 years your income doubles. In the last 10 years, income has gone sideways. So for 10 years, people have not had the kind of improvement in living standards they've come to expect.
Will this make it any better?
Leaving the European Union?
Yes.
In the short run, most of the analysis the Institute has conducted, and most economists think that leaving a free trade area is going to damage economic prospects in the short run, and indeed in the long run.
How do you define short and long run? In years?
For economists, we tend to think of the short run as up to 2 to 3 years, and in the long run, once you can move all factors of production, 10 to 15 years. That's the kind of idea that we have for short.
So in 2 to 3 years from 2019, you see short-term damage?
I think there's well-established economic measure on those kinds of damages. We've seen already volatility in the exchange rate, which makes it hard for importers and exporters to price their goods. It also makes it hard for those people who are moving capital around the world to understand what the returns are in their own domestic currency. The fact we're entering into negotiations that are going to take at least 2 years introduces a large amount of uncertainty into firms' planning. Where do I invest? Is it in the UK or is it somewhere else? It's hard to know when you're detaching from a well-established trading area, which is what we're in the process of doing.
Business does not like uncertainties, does it?
Businessmen would tend to say, and businesswomen would tend to say they don't like uncertainty. None of us, in the end, like uncertainty. We prefer certainty. Unfortunately, in this world, there's no such thing. Certainty is always and everywhere present. So the question is, how do you manage it? Not the fact we don't like it. I have uncertainty running this institute. We have uncertainty in our daily lives. I never quite know how long it's going to take me to get to work in the morning. But we have to manage it, and we have to mitigate against those uncertainties. So as I was saying, one of the problems with leaving the European Union is it damages our trade relations. It makes investment more likely to be delayed as firms try to understand the climate. It also sets up a process by which we may be withdrawing from the globalization that has yielded so many benefits to different parts of the world.
But particularly, trade will be the blocked with a K, of course. Britain cannot expect to trade with the EU on present terms. That the EU has made clear and Britain does not expect. So how much less could Britain live with?
Well, live with is one thing. We can end up living even in a world in which we don't prefer, but we can't. The estimates again from the Institute suggest that trade with Europe, which is currently governed by the most free trade agreement you could possibly have under the European Union, and of course is likely to be higher because Europe is on our doorstep. So there's two things that tend to govern trade: how rich a country is and how near it is to you. And we have both of those things with the European Union. And then we've decided to move away or reorient our trade to other parts of the world. This may mean that the level of trade with Europe may fall by up to 50%.
50%, you say?
Up to 50%. These are the kind of estimates that not only the Institute and other people have put forward. Now,
50% would be devastating.
Steady on. There's a number of things when we make those kinds of estimates we have to think about. Firstly, the exchange rate adjusts. So we've seen a 15 to 80% fall in the exchange rate, which makes our export sector and our tradable sector more attractive than it was before, and that starts to offset some of those effects. Secondly, we may decide to use that opportunity of exports and imports growing to build our tradable capacity that might lead to a different long-run effect.
With countries like the US, India, China?
And also possibly with Europe. Don't forget that many parts of the current manufacturing process require elements to come from different countries through a process. come to the UK for some final added and then go to the rest of the world. Certainly in terms of service sector, what we're doing through advertising or marketing or financial services is adding value to other bits of the value chain. And that may continue nevertheless. So these kinds of real economy estimates may be the worst case scenario.
But when we speak of WTO terms,
yes,
what are we talking about related to what exists as of now?
It's a very good question. We have a set of regulations under the European Union that tell us that we can trade basically free trade terms with the rest of Europe and that govern our trading links with the rest of the world. If we fall back on WTO rules, what we'll find is we don't actually know what the rule book is, because we'll fall back on rules that were set in 1973 before we left the European Union, when, as well, many of the forms of trade that we have now didn't even exist. What trade was there in computer games 40 odd years ago?
With Europe?
With Europe. In terms of...
what is it that Britain sells? What is it that it buys principally? Cars? Car components?
Well, a whole range of things that would surprise you. It's not just cars. There's a whole range of real goods and service sector goods that the UK is involved with. As I said earlier, a lot of what goes on now is not the complete production of one item or widget in the UK. It's often part of a value chain. And it's important to remember that process. So
this would be a disruption down the line then?
This would be, sorry?
A disruption down the line or down the assembly line?
It's a disruption of the assembly line. It's a change in the firm's holding of inventories or stocks, because the ports and other areas will have to deal with things in a more slower way than they had in the past. It's not just a question more of allowing things to move through the country. They have to be checked and worked out what the duty payable would be. So the whole speed of trade is going to slow as well, which again will have some impacts.
Well, that does sound like a long-term, very long-term benefit, if at all, a generation or more even. But speaking of the nearer term, how far do you think trade with a country such as India, trade with China too, let's say, can fill in with the loss that is bound to follow a loss of the present trade terms with the EU?
Yes. Well, that depends upon the nature of the free trade, of the trade agreements that will have to cover goods and services with those countries. And we also know that trading goods and services goes hand in hand with an idea of labour mobility. So the answer depends upon the form of agreements we come up with. But we've done some work at the Institute to try and understand how much more we might get in the short run from trading with other parts of the world, as you said, the Commonwealth. And it looks like we might get a fifth of what we might lose back in the very short run. So a small fraction.
Well, a fifth is perhaps not that small a fraction, but it will depend really on the policies of the government. We saw Theresa May visit India and announce on day one that, well, the visa rules will stay as tight as they are and might even become tighter.
Yep.
Now, that's not a signal for openness that would go with the theoretical openness towards a country such as India.
Well, clearly, one of the main objectives of leaving the European Union is for the UK government to have a notion of re-establishing control over migration. And so it's very hard for the Prime Minister to go abroad to any country and say that I can give you trade in exchange for migration, because it's the one sort of red line that came out of the referendum debate.
And if all this can be sorted within 2 to 3 years of Britain leaving the EU, that sounds very optimistic, doesn't it?
Well, yes. Well, not leaving, but the start of the process. We're still in the European Union.
Is that 2 years from 2019,
yes.
Let's say?
So 2019. So the common view is this is going to be too difficult to achieve in this period. So we're going to have to end up with a series of transitional arrangements where a large part of the relationship with the European Union continues until we have final agreements with countries.
Despite all your cautionary words, Professor Chadha, you do see some reason for optimism down the line. We all hope you're right. Thank you very much for talking to us. We'll have more on the UK edition, more of the Indo-British story right here next weekend.